Hey everybody, welcome back to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. It's another Monday night. Happy to be with you this evening, and we're going to dive into the show here shortly. But you know the drill. I want to know where you're from. I want to know who you are. So do me a favor and just type in the chat box there. Type in where you're from, where you're tuning in from in the world. Remember, part of our goal at drpeterosborne.com and Gluten Free Society is we're trying to reach 100 million chronically sick people and get them the help they need. And the only way we can do that, right, is if you help me share. So that's the other thing I really, really want you to do is make sure you're sharing this video with somebody who could benefit from the topic. Make sure that you are sending them an email, tagging them, or sharing that URL with them. And we're going to get started tonight. Tonight's episode's a good one. We're going to be talking about the ugly truth about gluten-free diets. And I'll talk exactly what I mean by that in just a minute. Before we dive in, let's just see who we've got tuning in. We've got Paula from Everett, Washington, and Annette from Daisy from Camano Island, Washington. That's not heard of that place before. Welcome. We've got Barbara from Maine and Sandy from Orange County, California, and Ember from Ontario, Canada, and Harriet from Australia, and Lisa from Cincinnati, Ohio. We got Catherine from Evansville, Indiana, Lynn from Connecticut. Keep coming. We've got Marie from Toronto, Canada. We've got Becky from Houston. We got Wendy from Southern California. The list goes on and on. If I don't mention you, it's because there's so many popping through that we don't want to be announcing names all night. But this is great. Let me know where you're from. Canada is really representing tonight. And as always, Australia is always representing well with the United States. So welcome again to the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain Show. And so let's dive into the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. There was a recent study. So we're talking about the ugly truth about gluten-free diets. And I really don't mean the ugly truth because it's not really an ugly truth. It's a perceived marketing message, and there's a big we'll say there's a big body of people, industry, business that are trying to deter others away from the gluten-free diet, and it's really quite sad and unfortunate. And so there's a lot of research now being done. It's either being misconstrued or it's being done with a lot of wanting. But the publisher or the people who are talking about this research are trying to shine a negative light on the gluten-free diet. And so this hence the term, the ugly truth about the gluten-free diet. And one study in particular recently came out. It was actually published in the British Medical Journal, which usually publishes some really good research. Now, it's not that the study was a bad study. It was actually done out of Harvard. But what they were doing is they were taking diet surveys going back to 1986, and they were analyzing people's diets and having them fill out a survey every several years and then update that survey. And at the end, they crunched some data and they said that people who were following gluten-free diets had a potential for a higher risk of coronary artery disease. And that's what the media is portraying this study to have said. Now, that's not at all what the study said. As a matter of fact, what the study said is that the promotion of gluten-free diets among people without celiac disease should not be encouraged. But here's what they actually said. The avoidance of gluten may result in reduced consumption of beneficial whole grains, which may affect cardiovascular risk. So that was the conclusion of the study, right? And again, that a gluten-free diet can reduce beneficial whole grains. And because whole grains are helpful for cardiovascular risk. So it was because a gluten-free diet has reduction in whole grains, we think or surmise that some people could be affected, their cardiovascular risk could be affected, but the study didn't actually show people's cardiovascular risk. So it's very important to understand that you can't take a diet survey study that's fraught with we'll just say potential for error and bias, and also fraught with statistics and statistical analysis, which it can't accurately be assessed. We can't take that kind of information and make the claim that the gluten-free diet is now somehow bad. So one of the things I wanted to do tonight was really, really clarify that study that came out of BMJ, that people are extrapolating. They're taking that information saying that, oh, if you cut out whole grains from your diet, you may have an increased risk for heart disease, when in fact, That's not at all the reality of what the study said. The study specifically only showed people on low gluten or traditional gluten-free diets. They didn't analyze grain-free diets. They didn't analyze organic versus non-organic. They didn't analyze grass-fed, free-range organic versus the swill that most people eat, which is commercial meats, etc. So this study was there's really not a whole lot of conclusion that can even be made from it. But many of you have been writing in to the Gluten-Free Society and wondering what to make of that, and actually being quite nervous about that result, thinking that maybe that your risk for heart disease is now increased because you're following a gluten-free diet. Look, the reality is this. If cutting out whole grains from your diet increases your risk for heart disease, the only way it does that is through a reduction in fiber if you're not getting fiber from other dietary sources. So again, if you're getting fiber on a regular basis, and what do we want with fiber? We want 20 to 25 grams of fiber per day as a general rule of thumb, and again, higher is okay too, but as a minimum 20 to 25 grams of fiber a day. A lot of people going on a gluten-free diet are not actually going on a gluten-free diet. They're going on a highly processed diet that's full of processed corn, processed rice, and junk food products. So they are reducing their fiber intake in lieu of highly processed grain-based substitutes. But that, again, that's not a gluten-free diet. A true gluten-free diet, for those of you who don't know, a true gluten-free diet is a diet that has no grain whatsoever in it, but it's not replacing the lack of grain with highly processed food. So any of you who have read No Grain, No Pain, let's see here. Any of you who have read No Grain, No Pain, I'm putting up some pictures here, but what I really would just wanted to show you was this. If you've read it, you understand that a gluten-free diet is not a processed food diet, and you're not looking for substitute foods to incorporate into your diet that make you sicker. So again, if you've read recent studies, or if you've heard, if you've seen recent blog posts coming even from other doctors that are talking about how we don't recommend that people go grain-free or gluten-free, and this is why, unless they have celiac disease, to me, it's really a sad state when we're seeing that kind of thing come out, especially when we have thousands of research studies linking gluten exposure, including non-celiac gluten sensitivity, to a plethora of different autoimmune diseases, to a plethora of different inflammatory diseases, including heart disease. So to make the claim that a gluten-free diet may affect cardiovascular risk, when in fact we actually have direct evidence that gluten for many people causes pericarditis, inflammation around the heart, is pretty much a short-lived, we won't call it short-lived. It should be a short-lived. In other words, that information should be completely ignored. But it's a misconstruence of the data and misconstruence of the evidence, and I think it just was worth mentioning this evening. Now, as usual, as we're getting into tonight's show, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. But if you've got questions and you want me to answer your questions, as usual, we've got a pretty big audience tonight, so I want to make sure that you get those questions typed in now. And I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I possibly can before the end of tonight's show. So we've got more of you chiming in. We've got Rachel from, Jax, is that Jacksonville? And we've got Jackie from the OC, Orange County, California. A lot of you from OC tonight. We got Leanne from New Mexico. Oh, Jacksonville, Florida. We got Angie from Wyoming. We've got Barbara from St. Louis, Missouri. Lots of representation this evening. Now, I want to ask you guys a question, because here we're talking about the potential that a gluten-free diet, would create an increased risk for heart disease. How many of you actually had some form of cardiovascular inflammation or heart issues, whether it be heart palpitations, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or whether you had other things that you'd been diagnosed, whether it's pericarditis, swelling around the heart sac, the sac of the heart, and you went on a true gluten-free diet and you actually felt better? I'd love to hear your feedback in the audience. How many of you actually went true gluten-free, grain-free, and found that your symptoms actually improved if they were heart disease-based symptoms? Because again, I want those of you who've had that experience to share that with the other people who are tuning in tonight who may not have heard that before, because again, remember, together we can help more people. Okay, Remember, one of the things that happens when you're gluten sensitive, and there's two kinds of gluten sensitivity. There's celiac disease, which is what most people refer to as the autoimmune disease of the small intestine. But then there's what's oftentimes referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, NCGS for short. So NCGS is, again, it's a form of gluten reactivity or gluten reaction that does not manifest as celiac disease. So if you've gone in to a doctor, for example, and they've tested you for celiac disease and it was negative, but you felt dramatically better going gluten-free, it's very possible that you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, again, one of the best ways to determine whether or not you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity is with genetic testing. So genetic testing tells you whether or not you have the genes that give you the propensity to react to gluten when you get exposure to it, whereas celiac testing only tells you whether or not you've had enough accumulated damage over enough decades of time that you actually have villus atrophy in your small intestine. Again, you can have gluten damaging your body without villus atrophy showing up. It's actually quite common. That's why we have a name for it, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And again, if you're not sure, genetic testing is a great place to start. I'm going to also put up a link here for any of you who haven't already had this done. I'm going to pull this up. Give me just a second here, and I'll pull it up for you, and I'll put it in the feed. It's a quiz that you can take. It's just a simple quiz. And what this quiz, it just asks you a few questions, and based on your commentary, allows you to kind of get a good idea as to whether or not going gluten-free may be a right or a wrong move for you. And of course, it's just a quiz. And as I said, genetic testing is a better way to ascertain that. But if you're thinking about genetic testing and you haven't made the decision yet, take this quiz first. And if the quiz comes back positive, then you kind of have a justification for moving forward and looking at that a little bit more closely. But some of the things that happen when people go, when people don't have celiac disease, but they're being exposed to gluten, one of the things that can happen is malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies. And so it's actually quite common to see malnutrition. What I've done, I put up an image for you with some of the most common nutritional deficiencies associated with gluten sensitivity, but vitamin B12 and iron and calcium and magnesium and zinc and iodine, all very, very common. I see them on a regular basis in my practice, where people come to see me and we actually do testing for gluten sensitivity and do testing for nutritional deficits. So it's an extremely common side effect. Now, on that note, when somebody develops nutritional deficiency as a result of having a gluten problem, in essence, their gut's damaged sufficiently enough to cause malabsorption, even one nutritional deficiency, if it's bad enough, is enough to create a disease state. For example, an iron deficiency, when bad enough, creates anemia that can cause muscle pain and memory issues and brain fog, and it can cause severe pain syndrome. So that's just one nutrient, one deficiency that's very, very common as it relates to gluten. And so another example might be a vitamin B12 deficiency. Vitamin B12 can elevate a chemical in the body called homocysteine. Homocysteine is an independent risk factor for heart disease. So a person with gluten sensitivity could actually develop heart disease as a result of B vitamin deficiency. So again, I just want you guys to understand the magnitude of depth of thought that needs to go into a study before making the statement that a gluten-free diet could somehow be dangerous and that grains are somehow a necessity for human health. There's never been a study that's shown that. Certainly there are studies that show that whole food fibers are beneficial to the gut and are beneficial to humans. But we get whole food fibers from other sources beyond grain. Quite easy to do if you're eating wholesome, real food. That's really the takeaway. If you're on a gluten-free diet and you're eating wholesome, real food, you don't have to worry so much about that reduction in fiber increasing your risk for the development of cardiovascular issues or problems. So again, keep that in mind as we go through tonight. Now, one of the other side effects that commonly happens that's not related to celiac disease, but can happen very commonly to people who are consuming gluten, is hormone disruption. And, one of the things that can happen with gluten in terms of hormone disruption, and there are a number of research studies that show this, is we can see disruption in thyroid hormone. And this is actually one of the most common diseases in the United States today is hypothyroidism. It's actually, it wavers, I think, between #1 and #2 prescribed medication in the United States, which is thyroid medicine to treat Hashimoto's, which is a form of autoimmune hypothyroidism that has been linked to gluten sensitivity. Now, understand too that a low functioning thyroid can also increase your risk for obesity and cardiovascular disease. So, but again, by the same token, when we're saying that a gluten-free diet could increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, if a gluten-free diet is indicated and necessary, not going gluten-free will definitely increase your risk for heart disease. So, you know, we've got to keep those things in mind. Now, it's not just thyroid disease. A gluten sensitivity for many has been shown to disrupt estrogen. It's been shown to disrupt, for men, it's been shown to disrupt testosterone. It's been shown to disrupt follicle stimulating hormone that comes from the brain, leading to infertility and other health issues associated with hormonal imbalances. So it's not even just the thyroid, it's the sex steroids as well. It can also impact and affect adrenal hormones like cortisol. And one of the reasons why is chronic gluten exposure for someone with gluten sensitivity has increases inflammation, which puts a burden on the adrenal gland to hyperproduce cortisol to combat the inflammation. And elevations in cortisol can actually increase water retention, swelling, but cortisol, long-term overexcretion of cortisol causes muscle loss, and that muscle loss leads to muscle atrophy and weight gain, and it leads to pain syndromes, because when your muscles are dwindling, they're shortening around the joints, and that's going to lead to greater joint compression, which makes it hurt when you try to exercise. So again, I just want to emphasize that you don't want to fall, you know, kind of victim to the bandwagon thought process that somehow gluten-free diets are a bad move if you don't have celiac disease. There's plenty of evidence and plenty of information that's out there that shows that a gluten-free diet is extremely helpful, even for those who aren't diagnosed with celiac disease. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that a true gluten-free diet with whole foods versus the processed, you know, loaded carbohydrates and other junk can actually be a very healthy staple to follow. I like some of the questions that are coming in, so I'm going to start popping a few of these up here because I really like this one. Linda's asking, what about the Roundup on wheat nowadays that could lead to leaky gut? Yes, it can. Roundup does a lot of different things. One, as a pesticide, can damage the microbiome, but two, it's a chelating agent, so it can bind onto metals and it can interrupt. There's a pathway that it can interrupt that interferes with selenium and interferes with the production of neurotransmitter like serotonin in the gut, which can affect mood and alter thought. Remember that serotonin not only is it important for happiness, it's oftentimes referred to as a happy hormone, but it also plays a role in gut motility. So many people overexposing themselves to glyphosate have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, motility issues as a result of that disruption. So it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon at all to see that. Good question, Linda. Yeah, I like this question. So some of you are asking about oatmeal, and I'm going to put an article up because I think it bears mentioning. Oats are technically not gluten-free, and although they are gliadin-free, which gliadin is the name of one of the types of gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye, oats have a form of gluten called avenin. And avenin, in a number of research studies, has actually been shown to do damage to people with gluten sensitivity issues. So I'm going to put that up here, study on oats. You'll see it in the feed, so that you can understand a little bit better. Those of you who may be new to the show tonight and haven't read No Grain, No Pain, I want you to understand that oats can be extremely problematic, and as a matter of fact, in my experience, are almost always problematic for people with a gluten issue. So beware of the oats. One of the other factors around oats, and this is just another, I don't know if you saw the recall last year with Cheerios, but Cheerios had to do an entire recall because of contamination. So not only do oats have a gluten, but the particular oatmeal or Cheerios that were coming out of the factory were actually contaminated with wheat as well. Anytime you're looking at processed or packaged foods, you want to think twice, because the propensity for cross-contamination is quite high. Let's see here. Well, like this one, any connection between celiac disease and aplastic anemia? As a matter of fact, yes. I've actually seen a few cases where people had aplastic anemia and, you know, got their diet dialed in and the anemia actually resolved. So absolutely there is a connection there between those. Thanks for your question. Let's see. How does alcohol affect the microbiome? Catherine's asking. Wow, that's a topic. That's a whole show topic that we could really dive into. I'd say that one of the biggest ways that alcohol affects the microbiome is it overfeeds certain populations of bacteria. That is particularly, it can overfeed the yeast populations in the gut. And when you overfeed yeast populations, you can get all the side effects that come along with that. Yeast produce a number of chemical toxins that can be neurotoxins. Yeast also can produce toxins that can damage your liver, just like alcohol can damage your liver. Alcohol also causes B vitamin deficiency. And with that B vitamin deficiency, it can affect the turnover of the gut time. Remember, your gut has a life cycle of 2 to 7 days. So every 2 to 7 days, your gut cells are brand new, being turned over. But if you overconsume on alcohol and you create a B vitamin deficiency state, and your gut needs those B vitamins for the replication of RNA and DNA to do their proper turnover, this is one of the areas where you can get into trouble. We see this a lot with chemotherapy patients because chemotherapeutic agents also will damage the gut. And a person who doesn't have adequate B vitamin status, those are the people that get the most nauseous, that have the most vomiting, that have the most diarrhea. And oftentimes people going through chemotherapeutic regimens do really, really well on high doses of folate and vitamin B12 because it helps to stabilize the gut. Realizing that alcohol causes the depletion of those two vitamins can also destabilize the gut by not allowing it to generate adequate DNA and RNA to help the cells recover and regenerate. Okay, good question so far. Oh, I like this one. So what are the ways to get gluten out of your body when you've stopped eating gluten? So like if we're trying to accelerate gluten detoxification, how do we get it out of ourselves quicker? One of the best ways to get it out of you quicker is fasting. You know, fasting can be a very, very effective tool, and there are different methods of fasting. You know, some people do really well with intermittent fasting. Some people do really well with a full 24-hour or 3-day fast, and some people do even well with an even longer fast. I don't recommend fasts longer than 3 days without having good supervision around you or having somebody who can help guide you in case you get into trouble. But I'm going to post a link up here on fasting. I did a whole show once on fasting for rapid healing of the gut and helping kind of detoxify and speed that process up. So I just posted that up there for you, and hopefully that article is going to be helpful for you. Tara says, "Oh man, we're getting so many questions. Let me back up because I'm getting ahead of the game here. I'm getting ahead of the curve." Oh, Misty's chiming in from the scleroderma group. Hey, Misty, good to have you back on the show again. Oh, I like this because it's very important. So Mary Ann Boucher says, please, please, please inform others about gluten in so many medications, toothpaste, envelopes, not to mention so many other things. So many think it's just in food. Love that you brought that up. We also did I did an interview once with a pharmacist on this very topic where we were talking about gluten in medications. And I think on that note, I'm going to put a copy of that interview up there for many of you. I'm just trying to give as much information to as many of you listening tonight that hopefully none of this information is entirely new, but gluten in medications can be a very big problem. And sometimes it's the gluten in the medication, like the filler, particularly the starch-based fillers. The maltodextrose is a common filler in medications that can be derived from wheat, but so can many of the other fillers. But sometimes it's the medication itself that actually creates the gut damage that makes you even more susceptible to the gluten as well. And so, for example, there's a class of blood pressure medication that has actually been shown to cause celiac disease. It actually, in a number of studies, has been directly shown or tied to the development of celiac disease, meaning the medicine itself caused the celiac disease, not the gluten. And so, you know, part of the problem there is if you got a medication that can cause what doctors are looking at and calling celiac disease, and you've been given a diet prescription, but you haven't had your medication changed, that could also spell big problems for you, not knowing that the medication itself could create could create the issue. Okay. Let's see here. More and more of you from Canada. Anita from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. We've got Nancy from New Mexico. Hi, Nancy. Tammy from Memphis, Tennessee, and Lori from Utah, and Christina from North Canton, Ohio. We got the Philippines representing. L's representing Manila in the Philippines. Oh, I love this. So Catherine says, boo to that study. I'm gluten and dairy and sugar-free, and for 1 year, diabetes reversed and 80 pounds lost. Love that. I mean, think about that. Had you not gone gluten and dairy-free, you'd have been 80 pounds heavier. Does that increase your risk for heart disease, or does that reduce your risk for heart disease? And that's what I hate about studies of that nature, where they do, you know, a study where they do a cohort and they do a prospective diet analysis by giving people surveys to answer every 4 years. That's not a study design that's going to come to any kind of outcome that has any great accuracy or any great degree of information that's going to change or alter somebody's life for the better. It's just going to intend to lead to confusion. Let's see here. Next question coming in. Boy, this is a big one. Hoping you'll have time to talk a bit more from the second phase of the elimination diet from no grain, no pain. And should we remove all nuts and seeds along with all grains, soy, corn, nightshades? Also, what are your thoughts about vinegar and sweet fruit and a diet to rid yeast over? Wow, that's a monster question, Suzanne. Maybe I'll just take a piece of that tonight. I think we could do, and if there's enough interest, I think we could do a whole segment on kind of troubleshooting and diving deeper into the no grain, no pain protocol. Again, those of you who aren't aware of no grain, no pain, you can pick that book up at any major bookstore. You can buy it on Amazon. It's published by Simon & Schuster Touchstone, and it's kind of our authoritative background for clean diets, and it's a great place to start, chapter 7 and 8. What I'm going to do, Suzanne, is I'm going to answer your question about vinegar. Vinegar, depending on the type of vinegar, a lot of your white vinegars are derived from genetically modified corn. And that's one of the big problems with vinegar. Aside from the fact that it's corn, and you know, again, when we're trying to be on a grain-free diet, we don't like that. But aside from that fact, you also have the fact that it is typically genetically modified. So there's that potential for pesticide to be in it, particularly in this case, because corn is grown genetically. Usually that pesticide is Roundup or glyphosate. So we definitely look at vinegar in that regard as keeping it out of the diet and not in. Now, a good substitute for that would be like a nice organic apple cider vinegar if you're not allergic to apples. But if you know, many of you think, what do you mean allergic to apples? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. No, apple allergy is actually quite common. I see it probably once a week in my practice. So again, if you're not allergic to apples, apple cider vinegar is a good substitution for that. Okay. Yeah, so Huda says, hope to know whether eliminating legumes beyond the challenge phase is necessary for everyone or just those with reactions to it. It depends. You know, beyond the challenge phase, which is the first 30 days, avoiding legumes, some people try to make an introduction back with the legumes, but honestly, 30 days is not enough time to really allow for the gut healing to set in. And one of the problems with legumes are the lectins and the other compounds that are very hard to digest. And so people end up getting into trouble because their guts are not fully recovered. And then they start bringing back legumes in too aggressively, too strongly. Oh, here's another one. Off all hypertension medicines, insulin, and statins. Only one thing left. I guess I need to exercise more. Don't underemphasize or don't underplay the important role that exercise has. A lot of people will change their diet, not incorporate the exercise, but one of the most effective ways to improve your quality of life and your longevity is through building muscle. Now, you don't have to build, you know, a hulkular body. You can build lean muscle mass, and that's going to be accomplished obviously through exercise, through motion and movement, but very, very important. Well, I like this testimonial here. Paula says, I was gluten grain-free for months, but still eating corn. When I gave that up, and I started feeling a lot better. Again, corn's not gluten-free. I'm gonna do this too, because I know some of you may be new to the show tonight, and I'm gonna put a link up on some of the research studies on corn gluten. Corn gluten has been actually quite extensively studied to be detrimental to people with gluten-sensitive issues. It's just that that research doesn't make it out there a lot. A lot of people are not talking about that research. And so I'm going to put it into the feed so you can read. Those of you who may not have read that yet can get a little bit of an update on that, because very, very important that you understand that if you're eating corn and you're not responding, or you're responding poorly to your diet, that may absolutely be one of the reasons why. Okay, let's see here. What about, I'm not sure I understand this question. Pernicious, I mean, I understand what about pernicious anemia, but what's the question? So pernicious anemia is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks intrinsic factor, which is the substance produced by parietal cells in your stomach to help you absorb vitamin B12. So it's not technically not a B12 deficiency, but it's an autoimmune reaction against your body's ability to absorb B12. You could have all the B12 in your diet, but not have the capacity to absorb it. There are a number of different lab tests that can be done to measure whether or not you have pernicious anemia. Get with your doc and ask. Number two, you can take a vitamin B12 in a sublingual form, and you've got to be super duper careful about sublingual B12. And one of the reasons why is, you know, to date, I've not yet been able to find a methylcobalamin, which is a high quality form of vitamin B12. I've not yet been able to find one that doesn't have some type of corn-based derivative. And so other than the one we actually, I had to, because I couldn't find one for my practice, I actually had to create one. That's the sad truth. And so we had to create it, and we use things like cherry extract to sweeten it instead of corn-based xylitol products or corn-based artificial sweeteners, or even corn-based natural flavors, which is what a lot of manufacturers do. But you've got to be super careful with, you know, with any form of B12. But one of the best ways to get B12 in, if your stomach or gastrointestinal tract is damaged, is to get it in through sublingual, for sublingual lozenge. I'll post a link up for those of you who want to read more about that. There, I just put that into the feed as well, some information about sublingual B12 supplementation. Let's see here. I need more fiber than 25 grams because of IBS. I have been using chia and flax, but I'm concerned about them. I have not felt a reaction. I am on disability and cannot afford the test to determine my sensitivity. So are these seeds okay? Lori, if you're following the True No Grain No Pain protocol, I would keep them out for 3 to 6 months first, and then bring them back in. If you need more fiber, understand you can get more fiber from other vegetables. Without adequate testing, though, it's really, really hard. I mean, some people struggle with other forms of fiber. If you're doing okay with chia and flax, but your health is struggling, then you actually may be reacting to them. You just may not be reacting to them acutely, meaning when you eat them, you don't feel bad. But if you feel bad all the time, that, you know, sometimes is one of the reasons why people can have delayed reactions to food, or slow reactions, or low-grade inflammatory reactions that aren't quite so obvious. So hard to know without actually running appropriate testing. But, you know, again, the best that you can do the best that you can do. Let's see. Here we go. Angela, heart palpitations, chest pains, and shortness of breath. And yes, removing wheat and corn did remove the issue. So again, going back to the question I asked earlier, which is how many of you felt better, had heart symptoms that dissipated and went away when you actually cut out grain from your diet? So Huda says, I wish I was able to do the 100% grain-free, keep trying and eliminate them, but keep falling for rice and gluten-free processed desserts. Get you a good support group, Huda. Those of you who don't know, I actually have a support community on Facebook. If you're interested, you just type in Dr. Osborne support community in your Facebook search box. Become part of our support community. And, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of having the right mindset, having the right people around you to give you great support when you're feeling weak or when you're feeling vulnerable, and having those moments. So, you know, get in our support group, and that might help you kind of overcome that hurdle. You know, I like this. Jackie says, interesting. I had heart issue years ago, but last ultrasound told me I had heart of 25-year-old after being gluten-free and dairy-free for several years. Love that. Thanks for the feedback. So I think this is a good comment. Richard says, there seems to be some evidence that total grain-free isn't good. I am gluten-free, but not grain-free. I still eat rice. I want to just clarify that. There isn't evidence that shows that grain-free isn't good. There's not a single bit of actual evidence that has any kind of long-term double-blind placebo randomized clinically controlled trials that show that avoidance of grain isn't good. I would highly discourage the consumption of rice, especially if you're gluten sensitive. Now, if you're not gluten sensitive, it may be another matter altogether. One of the issues with rice, though, is the high levels of lead and cadmium that it pulls from the soil, which is, again, I would just make note of that as well. I like this. Mary says, had high blood pressure. It's gone now as a result of going grain-free. Fantastic. Let's see. Nancy says, does surgical silicone have grains? To my knowledge, it does not. And I've looked at a number of MDSs. MDS is a material data sheet for, for different surgery-based products. Some people don't do well with surgical silicone, though. As a matter of fact, I'd post it here. Let me see if I'll pull up. I recently got back from California, and I did a lecture on autoimmune disease there. And one of the things I talked about, Nancy, was Asia. It's autoimmune inflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants. That's why we just say Asia for short. And silicone, for many people, can be an autoimmune inducing adjuvant. I'm going to post a link to that for you here. I'm just going to title it Autoimmune Lecture, and you can go back and watch it at your leisure. It's there at, I house it on Gluten Free Society, so you can go back and watch it as many times as you need to. But get to the section on Asia, autoimmune inflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants. Again, Asia, and some people don't do well with silicone for that reason. So, that could very well be part of what you're experiencing is the beginnings of that as a result of that, and maybe not, but possibility. But as far as my knowledge, and I've never read a materials data sheet on surgical silicone containing grain. Okay, let's see here. A lot of good questions tonight. Oh, another one. What about quinoa? Boy, we've had this conversation a time or two. Quinoa, there was a study done in 2012 on quinoa. Quinoa technically is not a grain. So we could say if we're following no grain, no pain, why is quinoa listed in the book as something to avoid? One of the reasons why is there was a study done on quinoa back in 2012 that showed that 2 of the 14 proteins in quinoa actually looked close enough like gluten that people who were eating it were reacting to it. And so I don't recommend quinoa, especially if you're in the no grain, no pain 30-day diet program, again, chapter 7 and 8 there. I don't recommend it for that period of time, and really probably more for 3 months plus. And then, beyond that, possibly questionable, but generally I have people stay off of quinoa as a result of that molecular mimicry, that similarity between the proteins in quinoa versus gluten. Okay, let's see here. Oh, I like this. This is a good comment. Sandy says, Doctor, I did your DNA test. I just wish I had done it years ago. You're right about one. You're positive, you stop cheating. Once you know you're positive, you stop cheating. That's true. I mean, I always say, give it to me in black and white. Don't give it to me in guesses and speculations. Test, don't guess, because when you're guessing, you kind of leave a little bit on the table as far as, should I be doing this? Should I not be doing this? And if you're not feeling quite better, why am I not feeling quite better? So then you go on to the next guess, or sometimes you quit the diet before it's time, before it's, and it's too soon. So again, a lot of people, when they don't have that black and white, have a really hard time of staying consistent. I always encourage knowing the black and white, one, because it's when you're talking about genetic testing for gluten sensitivity, it's permanent. Your genes don't change. What changes is the way your genes behave based on what they're being exposed to. And if you have gluten sensitive genes and you're exposing them to gluten, then their behavior is going to change into a behavior that promotes an inflammatory response. Does 23andMe include a test that includes gluten sensitivity? I know it is not a very conclusive test for that. No, I mean, it does. It contains a test that measures some of the celiac genes, but it does not include the part that measures non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So if you don't have a celiac gene, but you have a non-celiac gene, then 23andMe is not going to tell you whether that's the case. And a lot of people don't have celiac genes, but have the non-celiac genes. So 23andMe is, it's, maybe good for other things, but as far as for recognizing genetic gluten sensitivity, not so great. And I gotta say again, I know I said this earlier and put up a study on oatmeal, but there's a comment going into the feed right now that says oatmeal is gluten free. No, it is not, and I want to be very, very clear. We have to keep everybody on the same page. Oatmeal is considered gluten free based on a definition that was created in 1952. But if we actually look at oatmeal and we study the gluten in oatmeal called avenin, many people react to that form of gluten in a negative way. So technically, oatmeal is not gluten-free. One of the other problems with oatmeal is many of the oatmeal-based products are cross-contaminated with other forms of gluten like wheat, barley, and rice. So many people are reacting to oatmeal in that way. So again, let's just be clear. There's no such thing as a gluten-free grain. There's only such thing as gliadin-free grains. Remember, gliadin is one type of gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye, and it's what the United States it's what the FDA bases the definition on food labeling on, is just the form of gliadin or gluten found only in wheat, barley, and rye. So by law, a food manufacturer can call something gluten-free, even though it might have other forms of gluten in it from other grains. It only has to be free of wheat, barley, and rye to 20 parts per million to be able to be labeled gluten-free in the United States. It's somewhat misleading, and it gets a lot of people in trouble. I see it all the time in my office, people coming in who think they're on a gluten-free diet. They're not really on a gluten-free diet. When we really get it dialed in, a big chunk of their problem starts to go away and they feel so much better. Oh, I like this question, Cindy. So if you can't eat grains and you need to keep your vitamin K low due to meds, what are you supposed to eat? I think the bigger question to ask here is, why in anyone's right mind would you want to keep your vitamin K low? I would imagine it's because you're on a platelet drug like a warfarin or a Coumadin, where it's a vitamin K antagonist. So you're trying to thin your blood because you may have had a stroke or a heart attack or something along that line prior. A lot of doctors will go that route where they'll try to give you poisons to thin your blood, and they'll never talk to you about how you can naturally keep your blood thin by changing your diet. So what thins the blood naturally? Omega-3 fish oil. Magnesium thins the blood. Selenium keeps the blood thin. Garlic keeps the blood thin. Turmeric keeps the blood thin. There are plenty of natural options as opposed to taking and again, I don't know if this is your case or not, Cindy. I'm speculating here, so forgive me if I overstep. But why would you take rat poison, which is what Coumadin and warfarin are, to keep your blood thin when there are so many natural things to do it? My advice really would be to go have a conversation with your doctor about natural ways that you can also thin your blood, and actually monitor your clotting time, because some doctors don't want to have people go in the natural way. But look, the reality is you can go the natural way. You just make sure that it's effective by monitoring your clotting time and your prothrombin time. That, and any doctor can run those tests. They do it when they're monitoring the medication. They can do it when they're monitoring a natural solution as well. Remember, why does the blood get thick and sticky in the first place? It does because of inflammation. So if you avoid things that create inflammation and you feed your body and nourish your body naturally, you don't have to worry about avoiding healthy foods, because vitamin K comes in green leafy vegetables. And so telling you to avoid green leafy vegetables so that your medicine that's poisoning you can work better, it's kind of a paradoxical statement in and of itself. And that's why I would highly recommend that you go see somebody who may be willing to be a little bit more open and talk to you about a different approach. Okay, oh boy, that's a big question. Let's see here. I think I answered that one already in another question. Answered that question already. Okay, so we're getting some repeat questions coming in. Again, are organic oats okay? That question's coming in. And no, organic oats don't, they still contain gluten. Just because they're organic, one, doesn't mean they're not cross-contaminated, and two, doesn't mean they don't contain avenine, which again is a form of gluten that has been shown to damage many people with gluten sensitivity. Let's see here. So Derek says, going to see a dermatologist to look at my hidradenitis suppurativa. By the way, that's autoimmune. Been living with this for years, but never seen a professional. I'm nervous. Plus, I have reservations on docs trying to push drugs on me. I started the AIP diet, but I have lumps all over, and I want to get the best out of my visit. Any advice? I would say this, Derek, it's a great question. If your doctor is not willing to talk to you about diet and lifestyle recommendations to help you address that hidradenitis suppurativa, then you're probably not going to be super happy. You remember that a lot of doctors, what they do when you come in with a problem is they want to give you a prescription medication to mask the symptoms that problem is manifesting as opposed to trying to ask a different question, which is, why is that problem happening? And so, my advice to any of you listening is, if you've got a relationship with a doctor and the doctor's saying, take this, it will block your symptoms, but not having the why conversation about why your symptoms are there in the first place, then what you're doing is you're basically artificially manipulating your own chemistry to mask your body's warning symptom or warning signs. And that ultimately will never lead to any type of fruition in an improvement in your health. And that's what it should be about. Your visit to your doctor should be about improving your health, not about suppressing your symptoms. They're very, very different things. Let's see. When a B12 deficiency causes cardiac problems, does it usually manifest as right-sided failure, cardiomegaly? How does one distinguish between the shortness of breath related to this versus anemia? One of the best things to do if you have, so let me make sure I understand your question, Andy. It's when a B12 deficiency causes cardiac problems. It's generally it's causing it in one of two ways. So B12 deficiency can cause cardiac problems as a result directly of the overproduction of a chemical called homocysteine, which is a toxin to the heart and the cardiovascular system. But the other way that vitamin B12 deficiency can manifest as a heart problem is through the causation of what's called macrocytic anemia, meaning that your red blood cells themselves can't mature. You need B12 for your red blood cells to mature. So when your red blood cells are born, they're very large. And as they mature, they get smaller. And as they mature again, they get even smaller and they take on a concave shape where oxygen can now sit into that red blood cell. That's how you carry oxygen. So when you have a B12 deficiency anemia, those cells get stuck in large mode. And so think of it as they're clumsy. They don't carry oxygen as well. And with that lack of oxygen, your heart will work harder to try to get more oxygen to your tissues. And that failure can occur on either side. It doesn't have to occur only on the right side. So I'd say an ultrasound and maybe an EKG might give you a little bit better of an answer there. But even more importantly, I would ask your doctor to do a thorough nutritional evaluation where they're measuring several different things. One, they're measuring your nutritional status, not just B12 and iron, but measuring the other B vitamins and measuring some of the other nutrients that affect the function of your heart, like CoQ10 and vitamin B1, because vitamin B1 deficiency can cause congestion of the heart, and CoQ10 deficiency can cause cardiomyopathy as well. So you want to have all those things measured so that you have a clearer picture of what actually is going on, and if you need supplementation, what that needs to look like. And also so that if you need to change your diet to incorporate more foods that contain certain nutrients, you know what that looks like. But I'd also, if you have a lot of nutritional deficiencies, part two to that equation is to have your doctor check your gut function to make sure that your gut is appropriately working to break your food down, to extrapolate those nutrients from the food so that you can properly absorb them. Because just addressing everything with supplementation without knowing the status of your gut is not necessarily a full solution. It's just a partial solution. Oh, let's see. Elena is asking about, wow, that's a heck of a question, Elena. I'm going to kind of skip to the chase on that. If you have cultured out Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a type of bacterial infection, from your urine, it can be tricky. A lot of Pseudomonas are antibiotic resistant, and they can form biofilms. One of the things that can be helpful as far as nutritional support is concerned is the use of enzymes, proteolytic enzymes, to help degrade biofilm so that antibiotic you've been prescribed might be more effective. It won't interfere with your antibiotic. Some people also find that it's very effective with Pseudomonas to use berberine, which is a plant extract. It can also have a very potentially strong effect against Pseudomonas. And sometimes, in cases where antibiotics have failed, I've seen berberine be the thing that actually worked. Cynthia says, is there any grain which is 100% gluten-free? No such thing as a gluten-free grain. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. Should I be grain-free? Possibly. There are other reasons people can. So understand, autoimmune disease, including rheumatoid arthritis, there are 4 trigger factors, chemical trigger factors for autoimmunity. One is food, and gluten is probably the most well-studied, but there certainly are other foods as well that can trigger that. One is infection. Sometimes rheumatological arthritis is caused as a result of infection, and sometimes it's caused as a result of chemical exposure, and sometimes it's caused as a result of nutritional deficit, and sometimes it's a mixture of all 4. So the best thing that you can do, you can go grain-free. It certainly won't hurt you to go grain-free as long as you're keeping your vegetable and your real food up, and you might notice that it helps you quite a bit. But whether or not you're actually gluten sensitive and you need to be absolutely grain-free for the rest of your life as an attempt to help improve the outcome of your RA, that's something that genetic testing could tell you. And that's what I would highly recommend if you're really on the fence about that and you're trying to figure out whether or not that's what needs to happen. Go get genetic testing done. I'll throw a link up for you in the feed here where you can get some genetic testing done. And that way you can get a better answer. So just give me a second. I'll put that in for you. There you go. Just plug that in. So you should be seeing that now. Okay, let's see here. Candice asks, connection between celiac or gluten sensitive and mycotoxins from toxic mold exposure. Not really a connection. I mean, you can be gluten sensitive and be being exposed to toxic mold at the same time, and the symptoms have a lot of overlap, but I'm not going to say that gluten sensitivity causes mycotoxins. Although many grains, this is completely aside from gluten, but many grains contain mycotoxins. For example, corn is oftentimes contaminated with aflatoxin, which is a type of mycotoxin that can make people's immune systems become suppressed and make them very sick. So there's a linkage between grain containing mycotoxins. And so if you're eating high quantities of grain, you may be getting high quantities of mycotoxin that you're reacting to, aside from gluten sensitivity. But I hope that answers your question. In essence, gluten sensitivity and mycotoxin poisoning are 2 very different things, although you can get gluten and mycotoxins from grain both. Worried about the contamination in fish oil, DPA EPA, because of all the toxins in the ocean. What do you think of the algae forms? Don't like the algae forms. They don't do much for people. People are not designed so much to intake their fish oil from algae. If you really want a good version of omega, use Omega Max. It's tested for all the heavy metal toxins and other pollutants, and can be very, very effective supplement in that regard. Let's see if I can find a link for it. I'll put it up for you in the feed here. Give me just a second. Again, if I can find a link for you, I'll put that up. Oh, here we go. I just found it. I'm going to put that up into the feed for you. Give me just a second here, and that way you can go read more about it if you'd like. But it's called Omega Max. Okay, let's see here. We are just about out of time today. I think there's just no way I'm going to get to all the questions. They just don't stop coming. But that's why you tune in next week too. You tune in next week so we can get you more answers. Okay. What about glutamine to repair Willis? Define Willis for me. Glutamine is great for a gut that needs glutamine, but again, glutamine can also be too much glutamine can be potentially a problem for some people. So my advice is make sure you get tested for glutamine deficiency before just indeterminately using very high doses for very long periods of time. Let's see here. So what to do if daughter has C. diff and all the issues above, but doesn't have on B? Doctor says it's too soon to supplement with B. She's highly underweight and having seizures, and I'm truly scared for her. Wow, you've got a heck of a situation there, Wendy. Hard to say because there's just not enough information in there. But maybe go back to the doctor and have a conversation about probiotics, have a conversation about diet change, because a lot of times those things help the immune system. But if it's a true C. diff, you got to get that thing under control. One of the ways that hard to deal with C. diff one of the ways that you can actually naturally treat C. diff that's not being controlled by antibiotic use is through basically it's through a poop transfer, where you actually take the poop of a healthy person and you implant it into the rectum of the sick person. And that I've seen that actually be very curative for C. diff in many people. I don't actually do it in my practice, but there are certain gastroenterologists that will do that. So ask about that procedure, because it oftentimes is very effective, especially when there's an antibiotic resistant C. diff. Yvonne says, my balance is off. Could that be related to celiac? Absolutely, it could be. Balance disorder, there's actually a condition called cerebellar ataxia, and it is a neurological manifestation of gluten sensitivity, Yvonne. So yes, to answer your question very simply, yes, balance problems can be linked to gluten sensitivity. That being said, it doesn't mean that everyone who has a balance problem has a gluten problem. But at the same time, yes, gluten can cause that. So we are just about out of time. So we will see you back again next week, Monday night, every Monday at 6 p.m. minus holidays, right? I'm here for you to answer your questions and to get you health information and to get you moving in the right direction. So make sure you've got me in your calendar. Make sure that you've whitelisted or you've added my email to your contact list, because that's the way we notify you of this show, is we actually send out an email, usually on Mondays about an hour to 2 hours before the show starts. So if you want to make sure you're getting those reminders, make sure if you've got that email, check your promotion inbox if you've got one of those, and just take and make our contact part of your contact list. Make my email part of your contact list. That way you never miss an announcement when we're going to do a show. And sometimes we do surprise shows. So sometimes I just feel like jumping on because something was going on and I wanted to talk about it and want to make sure I got you guys educated, you guys and gals. So thanks so much for tuning in tonight. Again, remember what our mission is at Gluten Free Society. We are trying to help 100 million people find this kind of information and get the help that they need. And I really honestly can't do that without you. So please help me by sharing this video with somebody who you love, who you think could benefit from this information. Make sure that you are spreading the word, as we call it here. Make sure you're being the best gluten-free warrior advocate for a healthy lifestyle that you can be. That's the way we create community. That's the way we create a movement. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. We will see you next week. Have a fantastic Monday evening.